by Plato, and endeavors to explore, the thinking of transcendence, endeavors to explore this wholly unfamiliar territory. Such thinking refuses the closure of any achieved sense. The thinking of immanence too, in its way, strives to remain infinitely open, but does not readily acknowledge any absolute otherness. Understandably, since even this expression, like any other, is ridiculously inadequate for what it intends, and can indicate only by its failure, this absolute otherness. And yet, there is something beyond whatever we are able to articulate in this ongoing process, which remains infinitely open. By focusing on the correlations between all things and thinking of immanence, the thinking of immanence aims to be a revelation instead of the internal coherence of a process that englobes us together with everything else, just as nature does. And yet even this immanence is not seamless, as might be thought. It, too, is not without negation or heterogeneity. It opens infinitely from within and unfolds towards no fixed ground or anchor. It opens upon a void. By its relating to what is not, it takes on a shape homologous to the quest for transcendence. If it is not self-enclosed and complete, a totalized sphere of immanence, what I described earlier as that sterile self-identity, it cannot exclude what is other than it, nor therefore what in this sense transcends it. Now, one interesting feature of the hexagram, as made up of two trigrams, is that there is no line, either broken or unbroken, at its center, but rather a space. The center is empty. This embodies the spirit of the eating, for which true centrality is not occupied by any substance, but rather situates an ability to move and evolve in all directions. Each hexagram renders intelligible a phase in an ongoing process, and so is essentially linked with all the others. However, there is no overall fixed or formal order. Instead, responding to a complex and always changing situation forms our spirit. The true reality is change itself, and not the state that can be defined along the way by abstraction from the process as a whole. In this logic of renewal without end, nothing transcends the great process itself. The responsibility of humanity is to respond harmoniously to its summons and solicitations within this inexorable process, which will be felicitous or pernicious. This is faste ou néfaste in Julien's French. For us, depending on our ability to effectively play our part in the great process of the real. Now, here too, Julien, as always, draws very strong contrasts between the Chinese and the Greek Christian worldviews. The interaction of two principles, earth and heaven, yin and yang, which are contrary but nevertheless complementary poles, is the origin of all in China, as against the myth of the creator with a personal will in Western monotheism. And this idea of there is the figure of the Shangdi, the Lord on high, early on, but that disappears with the advent of the Zhou dynasty about the 11th century, and from then on, anthropomorphic representations of God are replaced by Tian, impersonal sky, while the ancient chthonic deities condense into the earth. So from this point on, in Julien's view, the entire effort of authors producing the Chinese classics is governed by a coherent vision of reality as founded on reciprocity and immanence. This way of differentiating Chinese from Western Greek Christian thought is very clear. It may seem incontrovertible. Nevertheless, it makes the difference consist in their controlling myths and images. Even if a certain layer of first-order anthropomorphizing myth has been stripped away, the yin-yang duality still functions in some wise as an explanatory representation encompassing the whole. Such representations, even by Julien's own acknowledgement, cannot be the deepest and truest stratum of Chinese thought. Even just in terms of its traditional myths and figures themselves, the originary duality in Chinese thought has remoter origin in non-being. Non-being is the origin of heaven and earth, we learned already in the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching. And this happens to be exactly what negative theology similarly informs us is the true sense or nonsense of Western creation myths as well. Critical apophatic philosophy insists that For the West, too, the explicit stories, the narratives, are negated and reversed by their unsayable origin in the nonsense beyond any and every stated or representable sense. Now, I'm willing to concede that the different mythologies are highly significant and define different cultural continents, but they do not finally determine different logics or realities so much as different ways and means of expression of common possibilities of thinking, a common reality, and even something beyond the reach of every culture's definitions, something absolute. In other words, they point to that for which there is no word, and yet that to which all alike remain related. I think I'm speaking in terms that are intelligible in terms of the Tao as much as of any kind of negative theological deity or absolute, but some sense of an absoluteness. Indeed, to that in which all are related to one another, rather than any word, but it's really this relatedness itself. And of course, that's where you have to start. But you can't exactly cut it off, draw a circle around it and say, that's all. To this extent, what is most deeply intended by one culture is not simply out of reach for the others, and thus cultures are not inaccessible to or exclusive of one another. What is aimed at in common by both Chinese wisdom and Western apophatic thought is not fully expressible in either culture's vocabulary or in any culture vocabulary whatsoever. Accordingly, only the failed attempts at expression are there as markers of the unsayable. Now, for me, what is at stake in intercultural philosophy is not defining one culture as against or in comparison with the other, but rather opening the dimension between cultures and beyond culture per se. This is the dimension, perhaps, of the ethical, the religious, the metaphysical. I take these as so many registers of transcendence, or ways of sounding what can be encountered at the limits of culture and language. There's this mysterious space that we cannot get our cultural terms or any terms around, but we're related to that. It's fundamental to what we experience as human beings, to what we do to one another as human beings. Of course, people give it names and interpretations, and that can even justify all kinds of heinous violence, as we know too well. But it also inspires the opposite, and it's part of human existence as it's been interpreted through these various different cultures in such interestingly different ways. What both Chinese wisdom and Western apophatic thought alike succeed in doing is effectively to escape, or rather to neutralize, the sphere of immanence that culture creates. Culture tends ineluctably to become a self-referential system, another or a second immanence separate from nature's. And so the task of apophatic thinking is to circumvent culture and all its concepts so as to expose what remains unsaid by and unconceived in them all. Logical thinking or critique, in contrast, by creating a sphere of immanence, is designed to exclude the ineffable nothing of nature, as Parmenides banishes non-being, and therewith also of relation to the all. This logic-based type of immanence is actually the abandon and suppression of nature as being beyond the range of the concept, and this disconnection and consequent self-enclosure of a thenceforth purely immanent nature is what apophatic thinking is called upon to reverse. And I'm finding in Julien, in Roger Ames as well, they too are powerful critics of this kind of logic, constrictive sort of thought. I bring Taoism and Western negative theological thinking together in their critique of the logos and of the consequent loss of touch with nature as all. Julien would presumably, at least in the first moment, resist this rapprochement, since he is loath to embrace and sometimes even to approach anything with an odor of theology. Many, if not most, philosophers today in our secular age are likely to share this view. But I wish to show why theology should, after all, be part of this conversation, and why excluding it mutilates our tradition and drastically diminishes the resources with which we work. We need now more than ever to reappropriate theology at a critical historical juncture that evinces powerful propensities towards transforming itself into a post-secular age. This has been recognized even by staunch defenders of the secular project of modernity, like Jürgen Habermas. And I think towards the end of the conference is actually already pointing us that direction, if you look at the program of Mario Renning's contribution. Our entering into post-secularity means that the secularist paradigm, which has dominated modern culture in its planetary expansion, will no longer be able to impose itself hegemonically to the suppression of all religious faiths and expressions that also make up such an important part of the cultural heritage of humanity. Julien sometimes insinuates that Chinese thought is free of theology or of ontotheology, and consequently of the illusion of transcendence, and that it therefore offers a better model of thinking, one that the West inevitably misses. This view, I submit, reflects a typical Parisian prejudice, a crypto-credo of the left bank. For what Julien actually finds in Chinese thought is essentially the apophatic, which on my analysis is the hidden core of theology in its limitlessly self-critical form as negative theology. The most subtle and penetrating thinking of precisely the insights that Julien is pursuing is to be found not by exclusion of theology, but rather by following it without limit or reserve in its own self-critique, which becomes even self-erasure or self-exclusion at certain radical extremes that may be represented, for example, by Simone Weil and Emmanuel Levinas. As Derrida once pointed out, negative theology is a kind of thinking that, by its own account, does not exist. If negative theology does exist, and this remains always doubtful, since no positive assertion whatever regarding negative theology can be unambiguously warranted, it does so only as its own self-subversion and self-annulment. I read Julien against himself in order to bring out what, for me too, are the most important philosophical insights for us today, ones that are richly, even incomparably expressed in traditional Chinese classics and wisdom literature. But this is, at the same time, also the deeper wisdom of the Occident in its negative theological apophatic traditions, or rather, counter-traditions. The strategy I recommend is to let ontotheological tradition deconstruct itself from within, rather than pounding on it from without, like Nietzsche, with a hammer. This is, in effect, what Nancy does in his deconstruction of Christianity, taking crucial cues from the insights of Marcel Gauchet. There is an embryo of this appreciation of Christianity's intrinsically self-deconstructing propensity already in Derrida, particularly in his teasing encounters with negative theology. Julien's usual construction of theology confines it practically to a worn-out cliché or catechism, and is far from exploiting the unlimited potential inherent in its subtly profound and inexhaustible archive. I enthusiastically follow and embrace Julien's development of apophatic thinking on the basis of the Chinese classics. It is only the largely implicit meta-narrative about overcoming the hang-ups of our Western theological transcendence-obsessed civilization through an eradication of theology, or ontotheology, that I wish to contest. Theological thought belongs to our richest, our most sophisticated, and our most generous heritage. Precisely in the form of negative theology, critical theological reflection has anticipated and paralleled virtually every type of insight and intellectual maneuver that Julien discovers in ancient Chinese tradition and elaborates in his own original ways. In its most radically apophatic representatives, negative theology is what we have to offer that can best complement the untold treasures of Chinese thought as Julien uncovers and discovers them for us. In culture at large, theology tends to be treated only in terms of the myths that it proffers for the masses, and especially for children, rather than in terms of its deep and subtle philosophical logic, which actually springs logic open to what cannot be logically comprehended. The nursery myths of religion are, of course, what are best known, because on the whole, we the people are childish. Consequently, it is these myths, most often rendered into the form of dogmas, with which we tend to be most familiar under the rubric of theology. This level of comprehension, moreover, is not to be spurned, since in certain respects the wisdom of children is the purest, the most whole and intact. It is not necessarily improved on, but may in some ways even be rather diminished by increasing dialectical sophistication and philosophical reflectiveness. Nonetheless, mature thinkers cannot abide simply within the confines of these myths and their translations into dogma, but are called upon instead to think critically beyond them. Now, Julien's construction of an intercultural dialogue with Western philosophy and classical Chinese wisdom runs parallel, in crucial respects, to the work of David Hull and Roger Ames in the Anglo-Saxon world. They voice many of the same objections to imposing Western notions of metaphysical transcendence on Chinese thought. Their objections are directed, in the first place, against the purportedly misleading use of words like heaven, truth, and freedom for translating key characters of the Chinese classics. The principal objection here is that it introduces a wholly inappropriate transcendental pretense into a type of thinking that thoroughly ignores such pretense. Thoroughly ignores transcendence. Chinese thought is presented rather as an alternative to the dominant metaphysical tendencies of Western thought that has seemed to so many in postmodern times to have led the West into a cul-de-sac. We stand to gain a richer perspective on the peculiar virtues and liabilities of Julien's work through comparison with such English-speaking and English-writing counterparts. The powerful motivation and necessity of such a project, as well as the limits of its validity, is determined by certain subtle yet crucial nuances can be made to stand out in relief by such comparison. For example, Ames and Hull suggest Tao should not be translated as way, but as way-making. This is an interesting and ingenious translation that usefully brings out certain essential emphases of the Tao. It avoids the static fixity of the nominative case, employing instead the gerundive to convey an actively verbal meaning. Nevertheless, this is but one aspect of the Tao, and this translation is but one possible interpretation among many. Somewhat perversely, such critically interpretive translations of key terms can steer the reader by the specific critical vision of the philosophers who are doing the translating even more peremptorily than is the case with the more traditional translations. I'm just suggesting some of the dialectic. A.C. Graham, too, I think, in responding to some of the translations of Ames and Hull, found that they were more in the order of exposition than translation, and perhaps didn't respect that boundary. These are controversial issues. I don't really have a fixed position on it. Obviously, I don't think there is, and neither does anyone like Roger Ames think that there is one right translation. I think it's the variety, actually, and trying different and new things, which is good. But nevertheless, dismissing the traditional translations, I worry, takes us further from just the poetic sensory image, heaven. Do we have to think of a Christian kingdom of God? But that word heaven, cultivated readers in the English language, they know that it's the heavens, De Caelo, Aristotle. There are a lot of different traditions. I think that we know that when we're reading a text from another culture, there are some different assumptions in play. And this word heaven, laden with both sensible reference and metaphysical resonance, is vague, a quality that is very much appreciated by translators such as Ames and Hull. It's open to different ideas and interpretations, hailing from many diverse cultural contexts. Now, obviously, it's all within a context, and Roger Ames and David Hull's translation is trying to combat certain dominant tendencies as they perceive them in our cultural context. Of course, that is all wide open to interpretation as well. I have the same reservation or question